Do you consider Mugabe as a
But
good
there was a
leader?
contradiction. But there was a contradiction. And the contradiction was Julius Nyerere also gave, I think Professor Lumumba always quotes this a number of times, to say that Julius Nyerere warned Robert Mugabe to say, you have been given a jewel in Africa, and you need to take care of this jewel in Africa and ensure that you do not destroy this jewel. The problem with that notion and the problem with what it is that Julius Nyerere was saying is he was saying maintain the status quo. Rhodesia, according to those leaders, was a jewel because it had more industry than any other country in Southern Africa. It had more industry than Tanzania and any other African country that had taken independence before South Africa. And so they believed that this industry, which was dilapidated, by the way, because of the sanctions that had been imposed by the United Nations, sanctions that the United Nations accepted to impose in 1965 with the support of the British, Americans, and Europeans to deliberately destroy that very same economy, so that when Zimbabwe got its independence, when Julius Nyerere was saying this, the economy had already been deindustrialized. So first of all, it illustrated a lack of information and knowledge from our leaders. It wasn't about Julius Nyerere. Our leaders saw the industrial buildings, they saw the industrial facilities, but they didn't know that that industry had already been destroyed so that it cannot be competitive against other industries in Africa and against the Chinese. So that industry was doomed to fail in the first place. Secondly, Julius Nyerere was seemingly suggesting that keep the whites controlling those industries, controlling that economy in what it looked like, so that you can have a better country. Do not allow industry to be destroyed. Do not allow the farming to stop, because that would mean that the country would go down. But for them to maintain the industry, for them to maintain the farming, meant maintaining the whites, meant keeping whites controlling the factors of production. But remember, we had gone to a war. Remember that liberation in Africa was a revolution. And a revolution is about breaking down an old system to bring in a new system. But here, Julius Nyerere, a person who advocated for a revolution, was now asking Mugabe not to revolutionize. He was asking Mugabe not to break the old system and to maintain it so that it would look like everything is okay. But Robert Mugabe quickly recognized that there was no way that Zimbabwe was ever going to be built by maintaining the old system, because the old system was about a minority controlling factors of production and making sure that they only use those factors of production to make themselves a profit, but not to benefit the majority. And he quickly realized that a minority-controlled economy will never empower the majority. He quickly realized that the reason why the Rhodesian government was removed was because it was only catering for 5% of the population. Whatever it was making was only benefiting that 5%, while 95% of Zimbabweans were staying in villages, in concentration camps that were called reserves, and they were not benefiting. That's why they rose up, went to Julius Nyerere's country to train and take up arms to come and remove this government that was not benefiting them. So Mugabe realized that we cannot maintain the status quo. We have to destabilize the status quo. And hence he had to now go undertake a revolution. Before he even undertook the revolution, it started with him supporting apartheid. The South Africans were fighting apartheid South Africa to get their independence. And guess what? The moment he started supporting the South Africans, the whites, the Europeans, the Americans, they basically gave assistance to the apartheid government to destabilize Zimbabwe. So while the ANC and the MK were getting training camps in Tanzania, getting training camps in Zambia, what was actually happening is the true wars were happening in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Angola. They were being attacked by these white South Africans. They were being attacked by the apartheid system because the apartheid system didn't want them to support these fighters to get a way through, come and fight back in South Africa and get support from the frontline states to liberate South Africa. So there was hypocrisy within the European system. And I believe that people like Julius Nyerere didn't fully appreciate this sabotage, this backbiting, this double-faced enemy that they were fighting, who was doing one thing in the face and sabotaging in the background. And as I say, that even that Zimbabwean economy that they thought was a jewel had already been destroyed by the time we get independence. Most of the industries were defunct. Most of the machinery was too old. Most of the factories could not compete. So it was deindustrialized by the time they were giving Mugabe this advice, because they did not understand the cunning of this enemy who did not want black people to have industry, did not want black people to manufacture, and they even crippled the biggest steel plant in Africa, which was in Zimbabwe, called Zisco Steel, so that black capacity would not be empowered. So we would have never maintained that jewel. We would have to break down the system, which is what Zimbabwe has done. We have to teach the black man to manufacture what is his. We have to teach the black man how to produce his own food, and to get through a period of suffering where we learn that blacks must not depend on whites, they must depend on themselves, and we might need to starve to get to that point. And I believe Zimbabwe has walked that journey, and we're beginning to get out of it. And what's ironic is Julius Nyerere himself didn't understand that Tanzania was walking that route. Today, Tanzania is one of the most progressive economies in Africa, because they were walking a route where they are not dependent on the white man. The black man has to learn to produce. Even though it didn't look rosy, even though it didn't look like a jewel, Tanzania was doing the right thing. And today, Tanzania is a long way from where it was. Kenya is a long way from where it was. Uganda is a long way from where it was. These economies have benefited from black people learning how to do it for themselves. And Southern Africa has been slower to do that than East Africa, than West Africa. And if you heard, Busita Bekwayo was actually talking about the entrepreneurs and the new multi-billion-dollar businesses that are rising in East Africa and in West Africa, because these young men, these young women, these black young men have learned that we have to become our own excellence, our own investors, and our own innovators. That is the benefit of what happened to Tanzania, what happened to East Africa, compared to what happened to Southern Africa, because Southern Africa is developing slower than those economies that didn't have white men and that didn't depend on white men once they got independent. You asked me, was Mugabe a good leader? You asked me if Mugabe was a good leader. He was a brilliant leader. Mugabe had vision. Mugabe is like, he was a teacher by profession, and he became a teacher and a father to Zimbabweans, teaching Zimbabweans the hard way that we are going to have to learn how to provide for ourselves. We're going to have to learn to build our own businesses. We're going to have to learn to communicate, to create our own television stations, our own communication channels. And that is what was so difficult for Zimbabweans to accept. They felt like they had a strict and very disciplinarian headmaster, disciplinarian teacher, and they hated him for that. But the truth of the matter is, he's the best thing that ever happened to us.
So one of the guests I had on the show said that one of the things that the US does exceptionally well, probably more than any other country, is create narratives, right? Because I'm pretty sure that when you ask most of the Africans right now, was Mugabe a good leader? I think you can guess the answer, right? You can guess what they're going to tell you. And it goes to show that, if you're an African leader and the West like you, then you're a bad leader to your people. But if you're an African leader and the West hate you, then you are definitely a good leader for your people.
100%. And the issue is Africans themselves, which is a weakness that Mugabe himself had, don't tell their own stories. So by Mugabe not telling his own stories, by Mugabe not telling the story of the revolution of Zimbabwe, the path walked by Zimbabwe. It's not only Mugabe that fell foul to this. Kwame Nkrumah fell foul to the same thing. Thomas Sankara is a hero everywhere else in Africa, but there was, for a very long time, he was not a hero in Burkina Faso. Hence, when he was removed, a lot of Burkinabes wanted him to be removed because they didn't see what he was doing and what he did. He was saying, let's not drive French cars. Let's not eat French food. Let's not wear French clothes. A lot of Africans didn't want that. And that's what Mugabe did too. And a lot of Africans didn't like that. You understand what I mean? The same happened to Kwame Nkrumah. When Kwame Nkrumah was removed, he was removed specifically for trying to Africanize Ghana and trying to chart a path of African development. It's the same with Nyerere. It's the same with Idi Amin. All African leaders are hated by their own people the moment they try to take the African path from the Western path. But where they fail is they fail to communicate, tell the story, and to educate their people on the path that the people have to take in order to build an Africa and nations that are fully liberated. They fail to tell their people that there's going to be pain, there's going to be suffering, there's going to be discomfort, and there's going to be a generation that has to wear overalls for their children to wear suits. And that is where Mugabe failed. That is where all African leaders are failing. Even in South Africa, where they've got the greatest media, the greatest movie-making industry, they are failing to make documentaries. They are failing to make movies and films. They are failing to create communication and entertainment that communicates to the young African spirit, the young African ideology, and inculcating an African ideology so that Africans can buy in onto the road that needs to be traveled to get us to where we need to get. And it doesn't start with our leaders. It starts in class. When we went to school, we were told that we have to pass. We have to get high marks to go to university, to get a good job. But no one told us why we need to go to university, why we have to get a job, what that job does, and how we need to use that job. They all made it seem like it's about us. They all made it seem like it's about being number one. They didn't tell us that, no, you get to school to learn skills. Those skills, you take them to work. At work, you're supposed to work and bring solutions to African problems so that Africa can rise and you can make money from bringing solutions to African problems. And once you bring African solutions to African problems, Africa prospers, and you prosper in your company, you make more profits, and you get a better continent that can now manufacture weapons to protect itself and can process its own resources. They didn't tell us that. They made it seem like going to school and getting a good job is an end unto itself. And that's where our leaders failed. Remember, Mugabe made Zimbabwe a liberated country. He was an educator. He made sure that Zimbabweans were educated, but he never told us why we were being educated. He made us seem we're being educated to make money so we can be number one, be the best. No, we were supposed to be educated so that we can process our resources. We can solve Zimbabwean problems. We can innovate solutions for Zimbabwe and ultimately innovate solutions for Africa with other Africans so that Africans can be better people. Mugabe didn't communicate that. I wish he had. And no African leader is communicating that. Even the most looked up upon leader on the African continent at this particular moment, which is Kagame, is not saying that. And we want our African leaders now to start explaining what the vision is. The vision is to take Africa forward. The vision is to bring solutions to African problems, and by so doing, creating jobs. And when we create those jobs, we incapacitate more people who must bring more solutions to Africa, who must consume less than they produce, so that Africa can become better. And more importantly, to make sure that what we're doing together in collaboration with other Africans, so that we can grow this continent. That's the weakness of the great and most powerful leaders we've had on the African continent, is they failed to give us the pathway and vision to this dream of building a better Africa. Kwame Nkrumah tried, but still he missed making that information understood by the common man. He made sure it was understood by the intellectuals and the leaders ignored it. Reason why Africa is still fragmented today is they took his advice on liberating Africa through revolution or negotiation, but they all ignored his advice of building one Africa and having one African leadership that builds the banks, the insurance systems, that process our resources, that share the resources of Africa to grow the whole of Africa. 60 years down the lane, we haven't done what he said, and we're losing.